My name is Andrea, and before starting the presentation, I actually wanted to give like a big shout out to the CocoaHeads organizers for putting together like these meetups, and also I want to like say thanks to Zalando for hosting this one. Yeah. So today I'm going to talk about backend-driven UI on mobile apps, which is like something similar to the talk we just saw, but there will be differences for sure, especially because it will be more like a story of how we built like backend-driven UI at Soundcloud on the when we rebuilt our main screen last year. And before starting, I want to just have like a quick slide about myself. Like I am originally from Italy, and I moved to Berlin to work at SoundCloud like 3 years ago as an iOS developer. And now I work in the core clients team, which is a team that builds the foundation of the 3 clients: iOS, Android, and web, and also some shared tools to try to make the life of our developers a little bit easier. And yeah, actually this slide it's not really true today because I had like both beer and a pizza, so it's like not really respecting what I'm saying. And yeah, when I thought about like giving this talk, I asked myself, why do you want to talk about this? There are other people that talk about this topic in the past, even tonight at this place, and I have quite an Italian accent, so I really needed like a valid reason to talk about this. And the main reason is that I think it was like one of the most successful projects I've seen at SoundCloud, at least on mobile. And we did that like more than a year ago. So now I think we have like the right experience to talk about it, because we shipped it in production for a year to like millions of users, and we can finally talk about that and share like what we learned. So my goal will be to try to convince you like that this approach is actually really interesting and it's working well for us. I actually think it's very interesting that we have like 2 very similar talks tonight, because we didn't talk to each other, and I was thinking before that maybe like it's actually a sign that both like big companies like Zalando and SoundCloud are seeing like the same problems, and they're trying to come up with like similar solutions. So there will be like cross topics today. But I think it's probably like an interesting topic if like we both came up with this. So the talk will be structured in 3 main sections. I will first talk about what's, in my opinion, like building the UI in the normal approach, and what's the difference when we talk about backend-driven UI. Then we will jump into the story of how we built the main screen at SoundCloud with this kind of like hybrid approach. And then I will give like a live demo on a simple app that I built for the talk. And of course, at the end, we will have like time for questions. So let's start with the first topic, like backend-driven UI versus normal way of building it. I want to be sure that we speak the same language. And for me, as like a mobile developer, when I think about the classic way of building UI, what I have in my mind is that we do that on the clients. So if we have like in this case like a web server, the web server is only responsible for like giving like the data to us, and we implement the layout on the clients in a static way. So if we want to render a screen with like a couple of labels, in my opinion, like the classic approach would be like a server returning us the data, us like building the xib, the storyboard, whatever thing you do on Android or on iOS or Android, and we would just render that on the client. We see some limitations at SoundCloud as Zalando as well. And what are the problems that we have been seeing while building the UI like this? It's a slow process. We want to change the layout of that label. We need to update the client. We need to update the iOS client, the Android client. We need to go through the stores. We need to release that, and we need developer work for like all the platforms on which we want to change the UI. This means that if you want to change like a small like detail on the screen, you might have to wait, I don't know, even like a couple of weeks before going live. For example, at SoundCloud we release every 2 weeks. So on average, it would actually take 2 weeks to ship like a very small change on the UI, and that's not very cool for us. So yeah, I think in general, like the main problem is that it's a slow process to update the UI, and also at SoundCloud, like we want to take our decisions based on data and not on impressions or like on our opinions, and so we try to A/B test a lot of things, collect the results, and make decisions based on data. And to do that, we also want to do that on UI elements and on the UI itself. And with the classic approach, it's really hard because you need to implement the logic for like doing like the A/B testing on the clients. You need to repeat that on all the clients you have, and it's not easy to like do it in a consistent way. So these are like the main limitations that we saw, and we were not the first ones. Like there were already like companies doing that, and we thought about like trying like a backend-driven approach to render some screens. And I came up like with just like a definition of backend-driven UI. In my opinion, is like when the capability of updating the UI without changing the code of the client. So yeah, that's what I think I have in my mind when I talk about backend-driven UI. And so if we see like a similar like screen of the one that we saw before, the way of implementing it with a backend-driven UI approach would be like in this case, like the server would not only return the data that needs to be displayed on the screen, but also, it would also tell us like some things about how we should display those like elements on the screen. If you notice, like in the JSON that this HTTP server is returning, there is not only like the data, but there is like the alignment position, for example, or the color of the label. So this is like a new internal language that like the clients and the server needs to speak and understand, and we can like kind of like control and tweak the UI by changing the response on the servers. I wanted to actually make it clear that these kind of things are really, they need to be like understood from the client. So we need like kind of like a contract between the clients and the server so that they can understand what they can render and what they can't. I mentioned that we're not the first one to talk or like to have such an approach. And actually Spotify has even released like an open source library, I think like 1 or 2 years ago. It's called the Hub. It's like a very powerful, amazing tool where you can render like almost arbitrary like UI elements based on a JSON definition. And you can see in the GIF live that you can just add an element in the JSON and the app would immediately like render that on screen. It's kind of like similar to the approach that we saw before. And yeah, this library is actually open source. You can even like give it a try if you're interested in it. I also wanted to mention that actually the library at some point got deprecated. I don't know the internal reasons why Spotify took this decision, but I wanted just to mention that for the sake of the presentation. But I think it was really worth to mention this library because it's like very powerful and well done. So I think all the developers in the room should agree that like building the screens with just defining a JSON, it's really nice. It should be easy. Like we would have like a better job if we could just like write a JSON and render it on screen like this. But of course there are problems. Nothing comes from free in software engineering. What we saw, I think it's like a very flexible approach, but there must be like some problems. What I think is that in general, like when you have to build like a generic UI element to render it on the screen, it's much harder than when you build like a button that you want to show on a specific screen where you know where it is, you know what's the content. There will be like much more challenges, and for sure like an overhead to build this genericity. It's more error prone for sure. Like if you can control everything from the backend and if you can change it, it means that you have much more UI paths that you don't even know when you're going to reach, when the users will, like, what kind of screens will they see. So how can you actually test all these possible paths if you are capable of rendering arbitrary UI elements? It's almost impossible to do that. And in general, I think it's clear that it's more error prone than a classic like static approach. And then you also have to consider retrocompatibility. Like we said before that there is like kind of like a language, new language that we are gonna like define between the server and the client. And what happens when you introduce something new, like a new element? What will the old clients do when you send a JSON with, okay, now you have to show this carousel on the UI, but the old version of the clients didn't know about that element. What would they do? We need to think about like this kind of new problems that before we didn't have. So when I was thinking about all these new problems, like in general, like the thing that came up to my mind was that in our job, like it's very often like the question that we have to ask ourselves is like where do we want to like put our choice, like where like we have to take a compromise between like the flexibility that we can have and the more challenges that will arrive. So we need to decide on which side we wanna stay. And to represent this kind of decision, I made like this slide where on the left we have the classic approach of building the UI, and we have like simplicity, right? We know what we want to show on the what we're going to show on the screen. It's not error-prone as the other approach, but we have no control on changing the UI from the backend, like zero control at all, right? While the more we go on the right, the more complex the solution becomes and more control we have. So I think that every company that wants to go into this kind of new way of building UI needs to think about where do I want to be in this graph? Like, do I want to be like extreme? Do I want to have like full control over my screens, but like then I will have to deal with all the problems, or do I want to sit of kind of in the middle? And well, I think that the most generic thing we have to render UI are still browsers. Like web browser, they're not like, we don't have full control even there, but it's very, very close to that. And then this library that that Spotify built, and probably the one that was presented before, I think they're very like on the right side. Like you have a lot of control. You can almost render like arbitrary UIs, but you also have all the challenges. What we decided to do at Soundcloud is kind of being in this like in the middle, on this kind of hybrid approach where we have some control, but not full control of what we want to change, because actually we don't need full control over the screen. But we have the possibilities to change the UI from the backend without updating the clients. So let's actually see how we build like this screen with this approach, and let's go more into the process of it. The screen that we built using this approach is the home. If you open SoundCloud now, like the main screen is actually been live for like more than a year with this implementation, and it's kind of like a list of playlists and tracks. It's like a music streaming app, so that's what you kind of expect there. And if you notice, like on the top we have a way of showing like a list of playlists, and on the bottom we have like a single big one. For the sake of like the presentation, we will just focus on these two elements, and we will see what's actually the process that we follow to build these elements and this screen. So the first step that we do is like we define a catalog of UI elements that we can use. It's like kind of like, imagine when you play like Lego, this step would be about defining the pieces that you can use to build your UI. And I will just show you like one of this, which is the one that you saw on the top. I just show like the skeleton of how it looks, and with more details, like, well, you have like some labels, you have an image where you might show like the artwork or whatever you want. There's like another collection on the bottom where we usually show what are the artists or the tracks that are included in the playlist, and we have another label on the bottom that we use to tell the users why do they get this playlist on their home screen. The interesting thing here is that we have all these elements, but we don't have to use them all. Like this is like an example of one playlist that is shown using that cell, which is not showing the subtitle. If I go back, see, like before there was like a title and a subtitle, but everything is optional. If you don't want to use something, you just don't send it from the backend, and the client will be smart enough to not show what it doesn't get. And also down you see like this is actually a place that I have in my home, and there is written that is based on my listening history, and there is my own profile pic there. But there could have been like a completely different layout if we wanted to use this cell for showing like a different playlist. And of course we also have like themes. Like this is like the same cell, but just with like a slightly different background with like different colors. And for the users, it looks like a bit different. For us, like for developers, maybe we immediately recognize that's like the same cell, but the users like don't care about these things, and they just think that's like a slightly different layout. So we can play with these things with like themes and changes that we can make to the elements. And at some point we sit down like probably with like designers and product designers, and we say, okay, what are the elements that we want to use to build this screen? So in this like simplified version, we say that we have one element to show a single playlist, we have another element to show like multiple playlists on the same line, and then, for example, we can have like another one to show like some promoted playlists from our sponsors, which looks like slightly different. So the first step, we have defined a catalog, we know what elements we can use, and then there is the most important part, in my opinion, which is to define the contract between the server and the clients. So we need to define like the language and what are the changes that we can make to all the elements. This is, of course, is defined on the backend side. I decided to represent it in Swift here just because it's an iOS meetup, and also because there is the concept of optionality on the backend as well that is not represented by JSON, but it is there. And the optionality is very important because of what I said before. Almost everything is optional, as you can notice. And when we don't send it, when we send it when we send it like a null value, then the client will not render that part on the UI. So this is the contract for the cell that we saw before. So it has all like the data that we need to show, and also some things to define like the appearance. We saw that the theme before. It's like there. It's like represented by an enum of possible values that we can have to customize the layout of that cell. And you remember, like before, we said like we need to be aware of like retrocompatibility, and we need to try to be future-proof. For example, this is like an enum that defines the themes. What happens if we introduce like a new theme? Like the old clients will not know about this new theme, right? So what we usually do is to try to be future-proof. Is that we try to always to fall back on a default value. So if we don't understand something, either we ignore it or we fall back to the default one. So if we have like a default theme, dark theme, or a sponsor theme, and then we decide to introduce a new like colorful theme, and we send that to the client that doesn't know about it, we would go probably into like a switch where it will go into the like default case and fall back to the default value. Then there is another interesting part, which is navigation. The way we implement the navigation in this kind of approach at Soundcloud is based on links, on deep links. So that the backend is actually deciding where the users will land when pressing on a cell, and that's coming from the backend in the deep link value. So imagine you have this cell that opens like the full screen playlist on another screen. That's like a deep link that the backend is giving to us, and we will just parse it and opening the screen. We will see all actually these details in the demo later, but I wanted to show like the full contract for a cell. And then we also have a web link, which we use to default to when we cannot understand a deep link. So imagine again like the backend like will send us like a deep link that the app doesn't know about. So we can't open that screen, right? It's not built in this version of the old client. In that case, we can open like a web view with like a real URL, because that's always easy to do. So we don't have to ruin the experience of the old clients, and we can still like manage to update like the latest releases while keeping the old one running. So we have a catalog of elements. We have defined the contract per every element, so we know what we can change. Then it's our turn, right? It's like we are iOS or mobile developers. We need to implement these generic UI elements, and we need to make sure the contract is fulfilled. So what do we have to do? We need to build these elements so that like this, let's say in the iOS world, this kind of like cells, whatever they are, like collection view cells or table view cells or whatever you like, they need to reflect the contract. So if there is a title and a subtitle with like the layout that we saw before, we need to be sure that they're rendered correctly. And if the title, for example, is not given by the server, like the layout actually has to, we need to update that to change all the constraints so that it still looks good. But compared to what we saw in the talk before, we're doing everything like on the client. So we don't have like a generic browser to show these UI elements. We just have this language of like IDs that could be like even the cell identifiers. So the backend would tell us like, can you show this playlist cell? And we on the client, we understand we know what the playlist cell is, and we can just render it on screen natively, like in a very similar way of what we were doing before this kind of approaches. We really want to make sure that everything is future-proof, as we said before. So we pay like extra attention on this, and we make some tests always to make sure that UI tests to make sure that the old clients don't break if you introduce something new. And of course, for the navigation, we need to implement deep link support so that we are capable of navigating accordingly to what the backend tell us. This for us is not really like a big deal, because anyway, for marketing reasons, as many companies, we need to implement deep links because they're heavily used for like in emails or social campaigns. So it actually comes for free for us because we're already implementing deep links before, and now we can use them for defining the navigation. And in general, I also think that is a good approach for like separating the responsibilities between like view controllers or views, and defining like a contract between different views, like on where we can navigate through. So we have the contract, we have a catalog of elements, we have implemented them on the client. What should we do next? Nothing, because now it's a really time like when we can change all the screens, we can update them, and they're gonna come for free. Like it's nothing on our side anymore. Yes, I remember like the first day when we like some like product managers and backend engineers together, like they worked on a new section of the screen, and all of a sudden like I opened the app and I saw that on the screen. You know, like if you're all iOS developers, you know that like the app you're working on, you know all the details of it. You launch it like 10 times a day, if not 50, I don't know. And I had like mixed feelings the first time I opened the app and I saw like a completely new section in the home. I was like, oh, is it good? Like I was really surprised. But then I realized it's really good because we don't want to spend a lot of time on building features, and we prefer like if they come for free. So this is actually the section that appeared in the home. We wanted to build like charts to see like the rankings in different countries, and we didn't do like anything on the clients. We just saw it there at some point because they just used like the elements that we defined together, and they put the right data into it, and the app was rendering those elements. That was, for me, was the moment when I realized that this approach was really, really working well for us. So to recap, like the hybrid approach that we are following at SoundCloud, for me, what's really important is that we only have control on what we need. We don't want to be super generic. We don't want to build like a very complex engine that could lead to errors. We just want to have this like slight control on A/B testing and changes that we can make without doing like new releases. As an example, we cannot change the font color or the font, but how many times do you change the font on your home screen? Like, we're good with that. And also, I also like strongly think that not every screen needs to be backend control. It does make sense when the content is like changing a lot. Like for example, before like in the Zalando app, I guess like that's changing a lot because it's really based on like who are the users that are opening the screen. For us, it's the same. Like every other streaming app, we have like recommendations in place. So if I open my home screen, is going to be different than yours. And in this case, I think it really does make sense to control it from the backend because we can give like better experiences to users, like more tailored even on the UI side. But for a screen like the settings, I would never build like with like a backend-driven UI approach because there is like a overhead on top of that, and if you don't have the benefits, why should you do it? And this like navigating with the deep links is also like a thing that we are really like enjoying, and it's helping us for simplifying the navigation, and it adds like that bit of flexibility that can save us in a couple of situations. So the main pros I think is productivity. As when I showed before, like the screen that we built without doing anything, it really showed us that we can continue to like iterate on the app and changing it with like less work on all the teams. We definitely have more flexibility for A/B test because we can control everything from the backend. So we can decide to show like one button to like a group of users and a different button to another group of users. It's easy to collect the results because everything is controlled from the backend. It's easy to do that on multi-platforms. So we could do the same experiment on Android and iOS at the same time. And this wasn't possible before, and it's like definitely like a plus for us. And then another important thing is unifying UI. I think is very important. Like we don't want, when we build like a very big app, it's very easy to repeat yourself in the UI. Maybe there are even different teams that are building similar UIs, and it's hard to sync and have like a catalog of UI elements that are used consistently between the apps. And these kind of approaches, like they help you to do that because when you're defining a catalog, it's really clear like what kind of UI elements you have and you can use. So it's also helping us to ensure like consistency on the UI level, and to not repeat ourselves on the UI side. So now I will show you like a demo. I will try because I will have like one hand to type and one hand to keep the mic. And and it's not even my computer, and I hope Xcode will not betray me now. But so I'm just so this app runs with like a local server that I'm about to run now. I just like there is like a local server that renders like that responds to the only API that the app is hitting with like a static JSON that we are gonna change. And let's just launch the app to see how it looks, and then we will have a look at what the backend is returning and what's happening under the hood. So like the app that I built is like a very simple. Can you see it? I can maybe increase the size of the simulator a bit. Yes, the app that I built is just like a very simple like news feed. Yeah, at the time there was like a tennis tournament. That was like the news I was getting in my feed. And I apologize for like the design. I'm really not a designer. I did my best for the demo, but it's really not good. And so yes, we have like we are just rendering like this news with predefined cell, which has like an image on the top, a label like to show the category, like a title and a subtitle. And of course I had to put some fake news into place also to have some fun about my country. And so now we look like how the JSON looks like for this response. So the JSON that the backend is like returning to the app has well an ID for like persistency reasons, and the category, which is the thing we're showing on the label, the title. So these are the data, and the style. So the style is like it's like a predefined constant, a top image card, which we can all think that it reflects like an identifier in our like collection or table view, right? So we know that we want to show this data on this kind of cell. So that's like an implicit assumption that we have between the client and the server. And later on, we will see that by changing the style, the app will update and show that the same content in a different layout. So we'll just show you the contract for this cell quickly. If I can Command Shift O with one hand, I will try. No. Okay. So this is the thing that we saw on the server, or like represented in the app, similar to like what we saw before in the slides. So we have like all the data that we need to show, and a style, which so far is like a string. It's very like open. It's not an enum, but later on in the flow of the app, it will be converted to an enum if we can understand the constant, and if we can't, we will fall back on a default style. And as I told you before, there is navigation, but that's gonna come later. And so that's like the way we are representing like the contract between the app and the server can play with these attributes or fields and decide how to change the UI. So, well, I will also show you like this new cell configuration, which is what I told you. It's like, so it translates into like the way of showing like that on the UI. So now like the style is not a string anymore, because we are kind of like on a view model layer, or depending on the architecture we use. But now this is like what we can use to really like create our like collection of view cells and render the data on the screen. So now I'm gonna change the backend response. So I'm gonna restart the server with another response, number 2, and I'm gonna run the app again. And then, in the meantime, we can have a look at the JSON and what did we change. So the JSON number 2, what did we change? Like imagine, like you remember, like the cell, it had like a title on 2 lines and a subtitle, right? And usually, like we define the constraints on the code, and maybe we realize that if we want to have like a longer title, it doesn't fit, it truncates, right? And there is like a product manager telling you, but this is not the layout that I had in my mind. Like for this kind of title, why don't we render it completely? Like it's a problem. And with the classic approach, we would have to release a new app, fix the constraints, wait like for a couple of weeks. The old clients will not update to that, so we'll have to wait a bit for the users to adopt the new version of the apps. While with this kind of approaches, we just change like the title to be longer, and we remove the author name. So in the JSON 1, there was my name as the author of the news, which no one really cares. So we got rid of that, and we increased the title. And now if we see how it renders on the screen, like we don't have my name here anymore. That was between like the category and the title was able to expand, right? So if we open like just to see what happens in the code very quickly on in this case, I have this pointer to the class where this happens. 1 sec. And so this is like it's the cell of the collection view for this specific style, and we have like a style function where the styling happens, and we check if we have the outer label or if we don't. In the case we don't, we just update the constraints so that we don't only like hide it, but we also change the constraints from the elements above. So we kind of know all the possible configurations that we have to handle. We do that in a similar way that we would do not like in a normal app, and so it's not something crazy or completely new. We just have to take care of these new possibilities. I'm gonna update the server again to return another response, number 3. And if you remember how it was before, there was the image on the top and then the title and the subtitle, right? That's it. Now I'm gonna rerun it, and we're gonna change the style of the elements. So in the JSON number 3, which I will now show to you, we change the style from top image card to bottom image card. It's a similar cell, but the image will go on the bottom, and we will rearrange the title and the subtitle on the top of it. We also change like the order of the elements, because of course in a backend-driven UI, it's like a way the UI is like declared from the backend. So we also expect the backend to control the order of the elements, and we only render like what we get. So in this case, we have the pizza now. It's going to be on top. Djokovic is going to be on the bottom. We changed the style from top to bottom. And we also added links, so we will see the navigation that before it wasn't working because it wasn't returned from the backend. So if this is running, yes. So the pizza is on the top, Djokovic is on the bottom. The cells are different. I don't know if you notice, like they're kind of similar, but we change their order, and this might be useful for us to like achieve like different kind of layouts and give like more. For example, we could do actually even an A/B test. Do users like click more on news where the image is on the top or on the bottom? Do they understand the navigation better? Maybe in this case because the title is there. And we could do like this test in a very controlled and simple way just by changing just that bit of the part of the answer from the backend. And so now we also have navigation. So if I press here, I navigate to the detail view. I haven't implemented it because of time reasons, but you can see that navigation is bound together because this is news number 2. Which is the first one, but we just flipped them, right? The pizza was number 2 and Djokovic was number 1. So if I open Djokovic, I'll open the news number 1. Let's see a bit like how this works in the code. So we will see the first like the enum that is defining the style, news item style. Let me get rid of the mic for a second. Yes, so we have this enum that is defining all the possible cells that we understand in this version of the client. We have the top one, that is the one we saw before. We have the bottom one, which is the one we're using now. And we have another one that we'll see later. And basically, the only thing we do is just we map that into an identifier. So it's really like simple. We use like an enum in between because we want to be type safe. And we want to make sure like we understand, we like speak the same language. But it's very simple at the end. It just maps like what we get from the server into an identifier that we know how to render on a table or a collection. And then we have this bit of thing because we also want to like decide what should be like the height of each element. We don't want to have like too much surprises. We could do this like in a more dynamic way, but why that? This is like our catalog. We have these cells. This is gonna be like like their height, and that's it. And now let's have a look at the links, how it works, how they work. Like, again, it's not very complex. Like we have implemented like a simple deep link navigator, which basically like takes a link, which is kind of like a deep link, and based on like a coordinator or a factory that knows like the view controllers, it will translate the link into a view controller. So we say I want to navigate to playlist /123. We will ask this class, can you navigate to playlist 123? And the class will be like, hey factory, can you give me like a view controller for playlist? And if we do have a view controller for playlist, we will push it. If we don't have a view controller for this deep link, we will not be able to navigate. and we will fall back to the web link that we saw before. So if I open the JSON again, here it is. In this case, like we are only returning like an app link. We don't have the fallback. So if the app wasn't able to open this news link, it would just not navigate. It would not implement the navigation. But in the next example, we will see like fallback on web and how it works. So let's run the server again with the next payload, which is number 4. I reran the app. I could have implemented pull to refresh, but I was a bit lazy. And so now the app will render JSON number 4, but before spoilers, let's see what did we change there. So unfortunately, like many free apps, they want to make money at some point, and what they usually do is like presenting ads to the users. So what we did in this example is the same thing. We decided it was the time to try to monetize that. And what's interesting here is that we don't have to release a new version of the app. If we build the app before with the concept of like there will be the possibility of showing ads, we just add like we change the response from the JSON by adding like this add part that defines an ad, and the app will just render the ad on top of the cell. So in this case, we have like our Djokovic news, which is defined in the same way as before, but we have an ad on top of it that points to Soundcloud, because that's where I work. And the ad has also the navigation, which is defined in the same way as the navigation that we defined before for the cells. So it uses like the same structure. But in this case, like ads usually very often are not shown like natively in views, or at least at SoundCloud, because very often we use like third-party libraries to render ads, and so we decided to just show the like implement the navigation from the ad with a web link. So in this case, we are saying that there is this ad, and when you click on the ad, it will open this link. So if I already build the app, yes, this is the ad. Again, I apologize for my design skills, but that's I actually got a bit inspired from the App Store. I was looking into it, how they were doing it. And so in this case, I can still press on Djokovic, and it will open the detail of the news. And now we have this ad that came here just from the JSON. And if I press on the call to action, it will open the link that we sent from the backend in a web view. So for me, this is like it's really powerful, because we just added like 1, 2, 3, like 6, 7 lines of code, and we added like an ad on a cell with the navigation. It looks like very simple, and it works pretty well. Let's see how it is implemented, like the navigation, the fallback navigation to web. It's very similar to what we saw before, but in this case, instead of asking a factory to give us back a view controller, we are just pushing the link on Safari. So again, it's not complex. We just in the app, actually the entire code is open source, so you can have a look if you're interested. And so if we get this URL from the backend, we just pass it to this class, and this class will just push it on Safari, which is what happened on the simulator before. I have the last payload, the last JSON, number 5, and in this case I won't even show it to you, just to kind of prove that we can change the UI even more. We based on how big the catalog is, we can even like radically change the UI of the app. In this case, this is really horrible. the UI of these elements is not so good, but we added like this kind of small news at the top of the screen, again without changing the client, and we just added like completely different news with different layouts, and we can mix all the elements, and we can build our screen just by defining a different JSON. And again, like the point of like the approach is really like to find a compromise for me between like how flexible and generic you want to be and how easy and simple you want to keep the things. So yeah, this was the last payload, and basically that's it for the demo. Mainly like that's it. So if you have questions, I will be happy to answer. Yes.
I do have a question here. You mentioned that one of the problems of this approach is future-proof, right? And you show some example of how you solve it, but how you solve it in the case of new components.
Yes, so the question is like, how can you be future-proof when you're introducing new components to the app? So for me, like, I think there are two approaches. Either you ignore it, so basically you don't render the new component on the screen, and if you have like a home with like a lot of elements, you might decide, okay, we accept the compromise of not showing this kind of element to the old clients, or even better is if you can default to an existing element with a different UI. So imagine like in the Swift world, you could have like a protocol which different cells conform to for getting like style, and if they share like a skeleton, you could render like you could render like a different element with a predefined element that you had before, right? So if you have like label number 1 existing in the client, and then you introduce like a new kind of label with a different layout, okay, you understand that the client doesn't know about this new label, and you try to render it on the previous one, and maybe you get rid of some details, but it's still better to not support clients, because in the classic approach, if you introduce something new, if you change the UI, the old clients won't see that, right?
How do you handle on Android?
Well, on Android, like the approach is really similar. Actually, we have one backend. We have like this backend to front-end approach, which defines like a layer that is shared between the mobile clients. And so on Android is very similar. The only thing that changes the way you implement the UI on the client side. So instead of using Caesar storyboards, you would use XML or like the Android tools, but it would be the same. Yes. Is it answered, or is the question answered, or yeah?
Are you able to respond with a JSON that is an array of 2 different objects? Because you've seen like JSON 3 and JSON 5, they differ in their style definition.
So in JSON 3 we have this style button image card, and JSON 4 we have the same one, or maybe you meant the JSON the last one.
Right. For example.
The only thing that changes is the constant, the value, like, right?
Right. And can you now put that object into JSON 3 alongside the other one and have like 2 different cells displayed?
Yes. So the question is like if you can combine different elements with different styles. Like yes, like the only thing you have to respect is the contract. So in the contract we said that every element has one style that can have like different values. So this is actually happening in the JSON number 5. We introduced like a new news, which is like this thing about Bitcoins, and here, so as if we respect the contract, so one style per element, here if we change this to top or bottom or min, it will update in the app and show it with a different layout. Was this the question? Is it answered, or yeah? Another one there? Yeah.
Maybe it's not a question, but I'm from Zalando. I don't have Zalando too. In this, I also work in the home app, home screen. We use something similar, but it's more dynamic. But the point that I'm trying to make is, since you've already worked on this, is there a possibility we could get together and try to figure out what strengths, what weaknesses does our approaches have, and come up with a better solution?
Of course. So if the question is if we should collaborate to make like the solution better together, my answer would be yes. Why not? Of course. Actually, I didn't know anything about it, and when I saw the demo before, I was really interested because
that one is one step ahead of what I'm talking about.
yeah, could even go better.
But
yes.
Anyways, we've been having the same technique for 3 years. If you open Zalando, the main phase is fully driven by flexible layout cube. That's what we call. This new one is supposed to be the successor of this one. But anyways, my point is we can collaborate on such things and try to.
Yes, maybe like I was thinking before, if like 2 big companies are doing like very similar approaches, there might be like many other ones that are doing similar things. And so maybe one day, like in the open source community, there will be actually some shared tools that we could also use and contribute to. But yeah, but for now, for me, it's definitely like yes, I think we should try to improve all of the apps. Why not?
That's good. Let's talk afterwards.
So also from Zalando. So one of the biggest pain points we have in this experience is managing the payload. So especially if you have a lot of different payloads for different countries, and it's very error prone, especially if not an engineer sitting down and looking at the JSON. have you solved this problem, like with certain tooling? How are you managing the payloads?
So the question is like, how do we manage like the changes in the payload to make sure that they don't break the apps? And of course, this is one of the points I mentioned before. It's hard, like it's an extra effort that we need to put in place. What we're trying to do is like to write a UI test based on payloads. So I think if you define a new payload and you write a UI test for that payload and you make sure that it renders like what you expect, then you should be okay with it. While if you give like the dynamicity to generate like a lot of like different payloads based on some other like conditions coming from the backend, then it would be really tough, I think. Yes. So we don't have like what you showed before, like to generate the UI, like a tool to generate the payload. We don't have such a thing because we want to try to keep it more under control.
Yeah. What do you use for UI testing?
On iOS, we use like the Apple framework, so you like Xcode UI test, and also on Android we use like the native frameworks. We were using before a tool that was called, I don't even remember the name anymore, Frank, a tool that was not really popular, I think, and then it was not a really good choice because they stopped like supporting new iOS versions. So the last version that we supported, I think it was 8 or 9, and at some point we had to rewrite all our UI tests into different frameworks. So that's a good lesson for trying to use like supported frameworks and not third-party libraries when you do these kind of things. Yeah. Yeah, thanks everyone.